So this is the last panel, which is basically a book presentation. And I think many of you know that Romani Studies programs, we started a critical Romani Studies book series by the Central European University. And at this panel, we are really happy to have with us Emily Poznanski, who is the director of the CEU Press, and also we have 2 authors out of 3 actually who already published their books. And we have Mirga-Kruszelnicka, who is the deputy director of the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture, and Anna just published this really beautiful book, actually, which looks aesthetically as well, really great, and mobilizing Romani ethnicity, Romani political activism in Argentina, Colombia, and Spain. And our second distinguished author is with us, Jekatyerina Dunajeva, who is a researcher at the Center for Social Sciences and assistant professor of political science at Pázmány Péter Catholic University. And the title of her book, Constructing Identities Over Time, Dead Gypsies and Good Roma in Russia and Hungary. So here is the book, and I would like to show to you. And so I think many of you know me. My name is Angéla, Kóczé, chair of the Romani Studies program. And I would like to chair this last session. And the way as we structured, so we would like to ask Emily to talk about the importance of this book series. What does it mean for the press? And after that, we ask Anna and Katya to present their talk in 15 minutes, and they can use a PowerPoint presentations as well. And after that, we can open the discussion. So, Emily, I would like to give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah? Great. So, thank you very much for inviting me to join the closing panel. I'll keep it brief because I think my role here is a bit of scene setting. So, I'll tell you a little bit about the press and what we're doing, some of the changes we're making, and how the series fits into that and its importance for the press. So the press, so I'll just speak in those 2 parts. So the press is about to celebrate its 30-year anniversary. We're starting those celebrations this summer. And it's a time for us to reflect on the changes that have happened since the founding of the press, to sort of look forward and to reshape the press accordingly. So, as you know, the university is changing, the relevance of the region is also, and so the press is thinking about its paths forward to reflect that. So the mission of the press since its founding has been to represent the voice of the region and to offer a better pathway to understand the history, culture, politics of Central and Eastern Europe and the global themes that are coming out of it. And so we do aim to engage a diverse array of scholarship that seeks to bring clarity and insight to the confusing times that we live in. So our base in Central Europe, we think of that as our sort of vantage point. Now working out of Vienna and Budapest, think of Central Europe as our vantage point to showcase the views that are often underrepresented in the global academic discourse. And this series does that remarkably well. So just a sort of a run through of some of the changes that are happening at the press in case you're not familiar with CEU Press and its recent changes. We're just about to launch a new site called the CEU Review of Books that's going to come out later this month. And that's a review site that will be reviewing books coming out of the region or written about the region. And those will be reviews in English, but of books also written in local languages, looking to bring something fairly unique to the market. We're relaunching our website with the new branding, but we're also growing our publishing list and focusing more on series like this one. One other aspect that I'll mention about the press, because again, it's relevant to 2 of the 3 books that have been published so far, is that we're developing an open access, well, we have developed an open access model to fund open access book publishing. The second book, the model is called Opening the Future. And we're working with a growing group of librarians to collectively fund open access publishing for our authors. And what that means is that future authors coming to us, if they don't have access to funding, we can turn to that pot and publish their book in open access without any cost to the author or the institution. So the aim there is to make open access book publishing more equitable, and that's something that we are fairly unique among university presses, or at the forefront of in publishing in general, because books are a little bit slower to open access publishing. So that's something that we're bringing in to the CEU and to the publishing world. So a little bit about the book series itself. I think you're all familiar with it, so I won't say much apart from it does exactly what the press aims to do. So it's interdisciplinary scholarship. It's looking for for authors within academia and to reach authors outside of academia, and its interdisciplinary nature, sort of seated within a human rights framework, is exactly the kinds of questions that we're looking to address at the press. We launched a new short book series recently called CU Press Perspectives, and there we're turning to authors to ask them, what are the big issues of our time? What kinds of questions should we be answering to help us in these sort of precarious moments that we find ourselves in? And I think this series is doing that sort of very naturally. So thank you for everything so far, and I'll hand over to the authors, which is the most important part. So
thank you. Thank you so much. Anna, can we ask you to be the first presenter?
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm really excited to be here, and here I'd like to start by saying thank you to the CU Press and to the CU for being at the forefront, as you mentioned, of this new publishing and facilitating greater stage and space for authors, which are trying to bring, critical perspectives and different commitments with academia and, academic role at the interest of also of social change. So I'm really happy to have also this beauty with me, which is here, an object of my pride. And this book, Mobilizing Romani Ethnicity, is, I would say, a direct result of my life's paths, somehow at the intersection of my personal, professional, and academic lives and interests, and how these lives have been really intertwined. So on the one hand, those of you who know me from my activist life, they know that I grew up close to Roma organizations and activism through the work of my father and many other of my family members in Poland and internationally. So I also began a life of an activist while I was still in my teens. At the same time, and since then, I worked and was engaged in my professional life as an employee, and also a volunteer, also a founder, creator of many Roma organizations in Poland and Spain, and many different initiatives internationally as well. And at the same time, I also pursued academic interests, having 2 MAs and 1 PhD, and my academic interests were really always somehow floating in the space of politics, social movement, and identity scholarship. And as I was developing academically as well, I was inquiring deeper because I wanted to understand the phenomenon of Roma activism, which I was living from within, from within of its actors and activities, but I wanted to understand a more specific framework or a systematic way in which I could understand this kind of civil rights struggle that was led by Roma and had a lot of non-Roma contributions too. But as I was looking deeper, I was finding difficulties in answering the questions that I was getting at, and I found some of the things that I found academically were somehow for me problematic. So on the one hand, when I was reading books on the so-called Roma movement, these books seem to present, seem somehow to present this phenomenon in a fragmented way, or they were somehow incomplete. They often looked from the outside at individual actors or at specific moments in time, and they focused much more on the outcome. So what are the successes, let's say, of Roma organizations or political parties, but they didn't look too much at the very process. And it rarely portrayed the intimacy of Roma organizations. So the things that I was living in my daily life as a professional as well. So what are the choices, the tactics, the dilemmas, what are the, the failures, the successes of Roma organizations and how they occur? And it was for me very important to argue that you could not understand ethnic mobilization through the prism of one single actor. On the contrary, it is through this dynamic web of interactions involving multiple actors, multiple voices, and also this field in which they produce and reproduce meaning. And it cannot be understood in a vacuum. It has to be understood in the broader political framework, in social contexts and circumstances. And then also much of the work that I was reading up to that point was that much of the scholarship focused on specific regions and countries, but I finished master's degree in comparative studies of civilization. So I was trained in comparative studies and comparative approaches. And I thought that complex answers can be fought for through this comparative outlook. And I found some, but not a lot of scholarship that looked in this way at Roma activism. And finally, I also found multiple conceptual and theoretical shortcomings. And for me, ethnic mobilization was a complex and dynamic phenomenon which needs to be analyzed systemically and holistically, also as a kind of a phenomenon that has different angles and different sides to it. So I wanted to really understand how I can look at this, activism life through a systemic, academic, and rigorous analytical framework. So I wanted to investigate comparatively, and I wanted to search for radically different contexts so that I could understand how ethnic mobilization among Roma occurs. And with this in mind, I developed some questions that guided me in my research, and then which made it eventually to this book. And the questions were, what triggers activism in the first place? What are the factors that actually activate Roma identity, Roma ethnic identity for mobilization and for collective struggle? And who are actually the people doing the mobilizing? What are the actors or the vehicles that are doing this mobilizing? And what are also the factors that contribute to successes and failures of Roma activism over time? And I looked at different stages of development of Roma political activism in different countries. And finally, I wanted to understand if I can distill and systematize these patterns that I found. And if so, what are the outcomes I could get at? So this was maybe a long introduction to just to say that this was the point of departure for a very rich academic journey, which spanned several years and which took me to travel, through 6 countries with over 300 interviews that I conducted with Roma and non-Roma intellectuals, activists, volunteers, leaders. And as a PhD student at Universitat Autónoma in Barcelona, and also as a fellow of the Open Society Foundations, later also as a postdoctoral fellow in the CU, I was traveling to Latin America to explore cases of Roma ethnic mobilization in non-European contexts. Because I thought that it's really important that we look beyond Europe to understand how we can understand activism, Roma activism in these radically diverse contexts. And the result of this journey of these many years and many countries and many interviews was actually this Mobilizing Roma Ethnicity book, which provides a critical exploration of ethnic mobilization in 3 countries, in 3 Spanish-speaking countries, Spain, Colombia, and Argentina. In all 3 of those countries, I traced the genealogy of Romani political activism. So I look at the broader history of Roma presence, Roma political engagement, but I also look at the broader socio-political context of how minorities are treated, how Roma politics are treated, how countries deal with diversity, to understand this broader political framework. I look at the actors, at these complex webs of interactions of the actors doing the mobilizing, how they develop, emerge, eventually disappear from the scene, and what are the interactions between them. And then I look at the frames of interests, of the narratives and discourses that they develop as they seek political gains. In this book, I provide a lot of original empirical data on Roma and Latin American countries. And I feel that this is one of the bigger contributions to Romani studies and to generally to science, because it opens up new avenues of inquiry in Romani studies. And it points to the global character of ethnic mobilization, but particularly also to Romani activism or Roma ethnic mobilization. Apart from empirical contributions and data and the kind of narrating the histories and the intimacies of Romani organizations in these 3 countries, I also provide or created a theoretical contribution in which I developed this synergic approach of ethnic mobilization that looks at the interplay between the political opportunities, so this broader socio-political context, then the mobilizing structures, so basically who are these actors or these vehicles who are doing the mobilizing, and then I look at identity frames, so these narratives and how they are intertwined. And in this book, I define this multi-directional character of mobilization, so internal, lateral, and internal, external, and lateral mobilization. And I outline these parallel lineages of Roma ethnic mobilization comparatively in 3 countries on 2 continents. And I arrive at conclusions of what is actually the nature of ethnic mobilization. And I invite you to look at that and then maybe engage the discussion. And then just to finalize, I think there's one really important thing that I would also like to highlight. Apart from these empirical and theoretical contributions, which are of course very important, I think that for me what was really important throughout this book, and this is like a recurrent theme throughout the book, is the discussion about the perspective of a minority scholar, of Romani scholar. So I actually want to look at, or I wanted to look at, you know, an original discussion of Roma positionality. So what does it actually mean to write from the perspective of an outsider within, of and how maybe we can look at the relationship between the researcher and the research, and how this relationship may change. And I really find that this is something really important. And the second contribution I think that's important is this global outlook on the Roma, and the importance of a transatlantic perspective, because Roma is, we are a global diaspora. We are not only in Europe, and much of the scholarship on Roma tends to be limited to Europe. And I think that we need to look back at Europe, of course, but we need to also engage somehow looking beyond. And this is important both for the development of Romani studies as a scientific discipline, but also it's important, I think, for the discussions of political activism, on identity politics, on you know, cultural heritage discussions. These are all important to look somehow beyond. So maybe I will leave it here. I really look forward to questions, and you know, I really hope that this book will be considered a personal, but somehow also academically rigorous contribution to literature of Roma political activism. And I would like to also thank Ethel Brooks for a powerful and beautiful foreword to my book, and also this beautiful cover designed by Małgorzata Mirga-Tas, which is also something that's always an added value. So yes, I leave it here, and thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to discussion.
Yeah, Thank you, Anna. You really made a very important contribution. So basically extending the spatial and critical Romani studies program. And I think we are really grateful for that. Now I would like to ask Katya to do the introduction, and after that we will have a further discussion.
Okay, and I brought Margaret just to show some photos and pictures along with the presentation. Okay, so this book is based on my dissertation that was field work for 15 months or so. It was funded by IREX, which is a Title I program of the US government, and SILF Fellowship. The research was conducted in 2013 and 14, and then I was sitting on this dissertation for a long time, and then it was published as part of this book. So I know this is tiny letters, and you don't need to read anything, but I was doing my PhD in the Department of Political Science at the University of Oregon, so my topic would not be too focused on Roma, but Roma are a case study of a larger debate about nation building and state building. So in this, I actually have to open my computer so I can see the tiny ones. But in this research, I'm trying to trace how state was managing its society over time and how Roma were featured in that process as the outsiders or the others during some phases of history, but not all phases of history, and how a conception of what a nation is determine these policies from the state towards their citizens. Today, I'm not going to talk about all of the phases, but basically how I divided up the research is I looked at pre-modern nation building, that was 17th and 18th century, early modern, mid-19th century until World War I, then the interwar period, which I had to divide to early socialism and post-World War I socialism because of the Soviet experience. And state socialist period and neo-modern period. And today I just want to talk about one slice of this book. It's open access, so everybody can read it for free. The reason why I'm looking at education and schools in particular is because when states want to manage their society and reach out to the society, then schools emerged as really a central institution. There is a lot of research about it in general, about how schools are the most important socializing institution. They're tied to the state, so this is really a site or a platform in which the state's relationship with its population can be studied. That it's monopolistic, of course, with the state being holding the monopoly, and centrally controlled. And it's a communication network, again, through which the state is communicating to its citizens. And also the curriculum tends to be in these two countries that I studied, but globally as well as state approved. So again, a very centralized system. So the schools, the education system as such emerged through literature as a site where citizens are generated, citizens are created, and where identities are managed. So for me, the question was how these identities are managed and how come some identities are managed in a way to make the good citizens, and then how come there are some other groups that are not making it into this category. So one slice I wanted to show is in the early Soviet Union, the nativization period, which I find very important. These are some pictures from textbooks that were printed in the 1920s and 1930s. The nativization period usually is considered to have ended by mid-1930s. And so for those of you who might not be as familiar with this period of the Soviet history, so under Lenin, the nationalist or minority nationality politics was very different than what it had become after the mid-1930s. And there, at that time, so again, 20s and early 30s, nationalities were promoted rather than homogenized. And they were promoted because there was a belief that only through a national language, the tenets of Marxism and Leninism can be communicated. So in order for that, many of the nationalities acquired written language for the first time. Among them were Roma. Many nationalities acquired schools in their own language, again, for the first time, and cultural institutions and newspapers through which they could communicate socialist messages amongst or to their people. So this is when, for example, you see the colored picture. This is from the Roman theater. It became a world-known theater because it was the first time that the Roma culture had its own institution to perform Roma dances, Roma theatrical pieces. Many of them were still disseminating values of socialism, but in Romani language. So the textbooks that you see, these are just pictures without the writing, but these, many of these textbooks, all of these textbooks that were written for the Romani schools were in Romani language. And as you see in the picture, there's a lot of stereotypes nevertheless. And so the stereotypes that you see, one is, for example, the cover picture of a children's textbook. You see on the top something that tries to be a symbolic image of what Roma household would look like. It's chaotic, it's dirty, everything's disorganized. And then the bottom is the school. So of course the school is again presented as the site that will organize the community, the society, a site where order and discipline are central features, a site where children are clean rather than on top where the children are dirty. Another page in a different textbook. Some textbooks were written for adults who were illiterate, other textbooks were written for children. In schools, you again see a juxtaposition of what was seen as Roma or backwards, so that hot-looking place where the little girl is going, and then on the other side, there is some cleaning and washing happening, and again, the school was a place where they learned. The textbook would have sentences like, my mother was a fortune teller, but now my mother works in the factory. My mother is a happy socialist worker, right? So in the book, there are a lot of excerpts from the book too, but the picture would be something that you see, that woman who is working in a factory. So it was meant to be also an emancipation, as they saw it, for the Roma women who could get out of the household and assume work and join the working class. So overall, the purpose of the education was, on the one hand, to imbue the values of Leninism and Marxism, but at the same time, there was a development of the national language and culture happening at the same time. Now, this nativization period ended shortly after Lenin's death, but nevertheless, these institutions that were established, like the Roman theater, were long-lived because the Roman theater is still open in Moscow. In Hungary, in the meantime, of course, none of this was present. In fact, there was a push to educate Romani children, but it was framed in terms of societal protection against deviance, diseases, and criminality. For the Russian archival work, there was these textbooks that I could work from. In the case of Hungary, I looked through textbooks that were available in the very few of them in the 20s, some in the 30s. Roma were barely mentioned. If they were mentioned, it was usually children's tales about somebody stealing something. And so the person stealing was a Roma. But I never got permission to publish the pictures, so they're not in the book. But what was coming through the newspapers in the Hungarian archives at the time is this urge to make them cleaner, make them more disciplined. And so the school, some of the schools that were featured in these newspapers in the 30s of Hungary were talking very proudly about their work in, for example, teaching Roma children how to wash themselves properly. So hygiene, proper hygiene was a very important aspect of education. So here, again, I was looking at the site of the schools in how they're forming, disciplining, and managing a certain group, in this case, the group of Roma. And then again, I'm not going to go through the chapters because it will be too long, but where Hungary and Russia merge, where they become very similar, is really the most recent turn to patriotic education. In Russia, there are now several policies on patriotic education building on one another about how the role of education is constructing loyal youth, loyal towards the regime. In Hungary, there's also an emphasis on patriotic education. There's a sense, and I'm using Brubaker's framework of nationalizing states, so states that are incomplete, that are unrealized, but nevertheless nation states that need to be investing more of the resources into promoting national culture. So in this context, of course, minority cultures are marginalized. They're not included in, so it's not a multicultural way of understanding the society. And that very clearly comes through the textbooks. And many textbook analysis, not focusing necessarily on Roma, were also pointing out how these nationalist values come across through both Russian and Hungarian textbooks. The state, the modern state, is a bureaucratic, rational institution that requires well-identifiable population. Now, there's a lot of literature that looks into how the state manages its society, but here it was very clear, for example, how schools cooperated with the police, especially in the Russian case, where they were very proud that the collaboration between the school and police is fruitful because the police knows the addresses, the police knows where to find people. So if somebody is not attending school, then they will outsource that task to the police. And so this can only happen in a society that is well managed, where there are addresses. Segregation was described as unavoidable in a sense that we need, our people who understand the culture well, and those who don't understand our culture or are from another culture, they need to be educated separately. And in the Russian case, actually, it was a lot stronger sense of separated education. What was different, however, in the two countries is the presence of the civil society, which in the Hungarian case, and until recently, was very active. In Russia, it was almost non-existent. So the word Roma, for example, in the Russian context is not understood. Nobody would know what that means. Everybody just refers to them as Tsyganie. This is all how they're known. So the relation and the connection between this movement, the Romani movement, and the Russian Roma is very small, with the exception of a few of the better known Roma, especially those who have, for example, positions in various institutions as researchers. Okay. And so fieldwork constituted basically me going to a lot of schools or staying. It was outside of St. Petersburg and outside of Budapest, and outside of Pécs, where there are several schools. And I was observing how teachers relate to the students and how everything was ordered in the school in order to make, this is what I call in the book, these bad gypsies, because there's a perception of badness, which is then internalized by the students. There was a big difference, however, how it was internalized by students in both Russia and Hungary. In both cases, there was a very strong sense of how the stereotypes about Roma students. So in terms of girls, there was an assumption of over-sexualized traditions. In terms of the boys, many of them were treated as soon-to-be criminals. So for example, in Russia, the stereotype about Roma men especially is that they are drug dealers. So many of the classes that I attended were changed in order to accommodate Roma needs. That is to say, for example, they would be making presentations about how unhealthy drugs are. And the teachers believed that that was important because they knew that these boys will be drug dealers unless they learn about how bad the drugs are. With the girls, it was, for example, not allowing lipstick. Lipstick was allowed for a non-Roma, but it was not allowed for Roma because their traditions are over-sexualized already. So lipsticks were part of it. Purses, they were not allowed to come to school with purses, only backpacks. The school would spend its own resources on buying backpacks so that girls don't use something that they saw as too feminine for that age group. And actually what was mentioned earlier too is the ordering of space around them and the suggestion of the hierarchy between them. So on the bottom, you see this was actually a trip organized for the students. So that's, of course, they're eating out of plastic. They were complaining why their plates, food was not of the standard that they would have hoped when they were comparing, for example, to teachers or others. And their response was that they're ungrateful, and their ungratefulness comes through not only in this complaint about this trip or school camp, but also because they're not grateful receiving government support. So there is a combination of how students or children's bodies are disciplined in this environment, already an overly disciplinary environment of schools. And in this way, there's a very strong sense of reproducing these racial hierarchies through the school system. Okay, and they're internalized, but again, internalized, and I included that picture, and I had to cut off the head of the picture because of privacy concerns. But what I was trying to show here is that these children who were at the settlement were actually very nice, not misbehaving children, but when they knew that a photo was being taken of them, they immediately took a pose. And they took a pose of something that they believed would be expected of them. So for the little boy, who actually was a very good student at the school, when he knew that I was taking a photo, he wanted to be, showing that he's strong, he's a macho, he's somebody that we would expect him to be because he's a Roma boy. So these internalization of these stereotypes, because many times the stereotypes were actually not based on realities of these families, would actually come across or would be taken in by these students and then acted upon as, for example, I have lots of other pictures like this, but this was striking that many of them would take a pose immediately when the picture was being taken. So the big difference, in Hungary, there was an internalization and pessimism. In Russia, however, there was a lot more of a dynamic view of the culture and optimism. And I'll just show you, this is my last slide. Anyways, this is based on the survey that I did in both communities in Russia and Hungary. And I asked in the survey how people thought about their identity. Not like this, it was more sophisticated than this, but basically I wanted to understand what they associate being Roma with. And these were the answers. So in both Russia and Hungary, the lack of discipline was mentioned a lot: laws, norms, traditions, culture, illiteracy, or lack of education. But then the difference was that in Hungary, for example, the poverty, lack of cleanliness, all these negative stereotypes were more present in how they defined themselves. In Russia, it was more about something that they related to culture, for example, dress, language, and sometimes some physical characteristics. Long story short, this I feel like the book is more organized than my talk today, but I'm trying to debate some of the questions. If, for example, lack of education is associated with being Roma, the question is, what happens if they receive education? And in the Hungarian context, there were a lot of debates about that. So do we move from the category of gypsy to the category of Roma, or what is happening with this paradox when it comes to, for example, the youth? And there were some sites, some schools where these questions were asked of the students themselves. Do they like to use Roma or do they like to use gypsy? There was always disagreement, very lively debates about what is better. Some believe that gypsy doesn't have to be carry a negative meaning, and they believe that rather than using a different word, we need to work on making the word gypsy something more acceptable and actually imbue it with positive meanings. But also, what was clear to me is that in the Russian context, there were a lot of references to the past. And this is why I showed you the nativization period in the 20s, because many people, even if they didn't have obviously memories of their own, were relating to all the institutional and cultural aspects of Roma life that were rooted in the 20s and early 30s. So that was carried over from generations, and that was lived, or that was used as an example of how Romani culture does not have to mean lack of education or poverty, but Romani culture can also mean a theater. Romani culture can also mean a language that has books that were published. And I thought that that was an important aspect of understanding how identity or labels that we use for certain identities don't have a static meaning, but rather it's a meaning that can be changed. And sometimes it's changed over generations, but there can be some aspects or some things that can be done in order to generate a change in how we relate to a certain ethnic label. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Katya. Really great. I think both presentations, and hopefully both you can read the book as well, and both by Katya and Anna as well. And also we have a third book actually by Jan Selling on Romani liberation. Unfortunately, he was not able to come, but one of the focus in his book as well, it's an identity and the liberation of identity. And it's also really interesting that both of you somehow touched upon the issue of identity, and in your case, Katya, like the historicization of identity and internalizing all these stigmas and stereotypes. And in the case of Anna, how identity can be used for political mobilization and how much is connected with political activism. So it's interesting really finding the identity as such through the critical Romani studies lens, what we heard from both of you. No, I wouldn't like to, abuse my power. Rather, I would like to give the floor to you and have a discussions, comments, questions, observations, what you would like to raise. Gopalas.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Gopalas, studying Cultural Heritage Studies program here at CU. My question goes to you, dear Jekatyerina. When you talked about Soviet legacy, it was kind of very general picture of it, yeah. And after you presented this internalization of this stereotype, yeah, you presented one example. I was wondering how many examples of this internalization you have, and to what extent, what is the extent of this internalization? Because Russia is very big, yeah. I mean, to what extent is applicable? To what extent I can say this stereotypical Roma image is internalized within communities and it goes as a fact. You know? To what extent can we take it for granted? Yeah. So I was interested how many examples, such examples you have in the research. That's my question. Thank you very much.
I always get this question. And it's a good one, and it's
because it's also generalization in a way.
Of course, and so in the book, which I probably say in every chapter, that in no way do I have enough data to generalize, and I can't do justice, of course, to the book in 15 minutes. But I'm not generalizing because it would be impossible. Russia is big, but the Roma population is actually not as big in terms of the percentage, for example, than in Hungary. But in both cases, I was in communities for months. So I didn't have a chance or opportunity to go through. So I have examples from these communities. It's not so generalizable, but to me, what was a striking difference is, for example, the children in the Russian school had plans of staying with their communities, and they, in general, had a pride of who they are, even though they were very different, visibly different, in every way different. You know, speaking with an accent, with this, all of them spoke the Romani language too. And in Hungary, if I asked children about their aspirations, they wanted to leave their community. So for them, the future was outside of that. Both were very poor and both were deprived in many ways. But at the same time, anyway, so I can't generalize, and I don't know to what extent it would be true to all of the Roma in Russia. But then it's quite an under-researched topic, and I don't know who's going for field work there now. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you. No problem.
Hi, Anna. Great to see you and congratulations on the book. I look forward to reading it, and same to you, Katya. Congratulations. And Katya, my question is to you, because while listening to your presentation, a whole process started in my mind. And then I realized that I should actually ask you about your own process of thinking about some of the issues that you mentioned. And I think that the first thing that comes to my mind, particularly because now I come from this US context, a little bit Americanized, and I wonder what was the process of basically deciding to use the word gypsy as a non-Roma, thinking also about your position in this space, how, even though it's in code, so what was the process there to actually use this, acknowledging the differences between, I don't know, Hungary and the Soviet Union and the UK or other regions? And the second one is a little bit more, and I'm curious to be in your book, is more about this idea that you launched towards the end of your presentation, which says that somehow this question, through education, do we really move from the category of gypsy to the category of Roma, or from that gypsy to good Roma? And I think that there is a whole question there about the process. Is gypsy the label that leads to prejudice, or when you become educated and you are labeled as a Roma, do you face less discrimination, or is gypsy a term that is one of the initial elements of race making of the Roma. As Indian, it was a process of race making of native people and in indigenous communities in the Americas. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about this process and, you know, which was where and how do you feel about using this term gypsy in your own work? And I'm asking with all the curiosity in the world, it's nothing judgmental.
Yeah, yeah. There's a chapter on that too in the book. I'm explaining the labels, but I was thinking about it for a while, and I think my reasoning was to do justice to how these concepts are used by the people themselves who were the subjects of this research, like, you know, for the field work. And many times when I talk, actually, again, in Russian, nobody uses the term Roma. It wouldn't even be understood. In the Hungarian context, when I talk to them and I use the word Roma, there were oftentimes comments like, why don't you dare saying the word gypsy? You know, like, do you think, so it was a challenge almost back to me, like, am I using the word Roma because I'm afraid to even say the word gypsies is something that means bad to me, which it didn't. But I wanted to do justice to those societies or communities with whom I work, and they only use the word gypsy. Should I not say that word anymore?
No.
Oh.
No, I just really would like to have a chance for Anna as well. Maybe one of you. There was another question. There was another question.
No, I mean, all of them.
Okay, someone else. Is there anyone who would like? Oh, wait.
Sorry, I'm not visible there. I'm going to stand up. I really like your presentation, and my question goes to get that. Yes, you mentioned that you work in different communities in Hungary. It's really heterogeneous, the Roma communities, and for Bash, for example, the term called gypsy is also core element of their identity. And how you have not just perceived, because I know it's a big debate that how people want to identify themselves, but the population, what kind of communities have you visited, and whether there was just the Black or Romani communities who express that they are Roma, or how you can think about this, because generally it's just from my point of view, when was a translation of Compasito and Compass by translated by a Hungarian translator who worked for the human rights. There is I have this embedded human rights trainer, and we have a quite big debate because they didn't want to accept the politically correct or the Council of Europe term. But it's another thing how the communities think about themselves. But I'm really curious that what kind of communities has you visited and how was this term, because I think one of the countries is Hungary, when some communities are being told gypsy did not consider it the anti-racism. So yeah.
I will not answer any questions. Nicole, I'm sure that you would like to ask something about Latin America.
Yeah. Too well. So first of all, congratulations to all. Really, really nice books. And are they out, by the way? That's my first question.
Yeah, look at them.
Okay. Yeah, I couldn't see them.
This part of the room is like
Yeah, kind of excluded. Okay, great. Thank you. The other question for Anna, I wanted to know, was there a particular country that you studied that was where you saw the most egregious examples, or just where the government was more, or society in general was more repressive, or where you saw more anti-Gypsyism than others? I don't know.
Thank you for the questions. Can I answer now, Angela?
Could you hear me?
Yes. Okay. So thank you for the questions. It's a good one. I think here there's two things that we should consider. One is that anti-Gypsyism was brought over from Europe, and as much as it's rooted in the European societies and imagery, it's so much so in Latin America and in the Americas in general. So the different, individual and institutional forms of anti-Gypsyism can be found pretty much everywhere. But what's really important is that in Latin America, Roma engaged in the process of self-invisibilization, basically hiding behind, a national identity, saying, "Oh, we're Bulgarian, we're Hungarian, we're Greek." They would manage to still kind of claim a European heritage. So in the societies where you have, indigenous communities and Afro-descendant communities, which are extremely marginalized, Roma would still seem somehow as whiter. So I think this is something that's really important to understand in this context of intercontinental analysis. But of course, Roma are also somehow hyper visible because many of these communities were on the axis of traditionality, they would be more towards the more traditional than less. So in Argentina, for example, you would have a lot of Roma women dressed, in typical wear, and there would be informations, for example, on the banks with, kind of an image of a Roma woman and with the message of be careful, there is some Roma women circling around, keep your money hidden. And, these kind of claims of Roma stealing children, of course, Roma theft, Roma criminality, that was as much present in the press or in public speech sometimes, and also in this kind of pop culture imagery, even if the communities would be really small. So in Colombia, for example, the community is really tiny, but still the anti-Gypsy stereotypes are very present. So it's, I think it's a very interesting kind of interplay of, reality and imagery of how the Gypsy, if I may say so, functions in, public imagery, even if it's not really present.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to you.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask Katia about comparison between Hungary and Russia, and you seem to me to imply that this kind of a pride in Gypsy culture in Russia, it was passed down to the generations kind of inside the families, or like what I would think of first hearing is maybe this is the macro society which somehow in Russia did not have this kind of culture which we have in Southeast Europe. Gypsies are like this uncivilized, uncivilized against civilized society. Well, in Russia, they only had this model of, the exotified, interesting folkloric culture, which Soviet Union developed. Does this play a role in the way that today's communities and research can feel like about themselves?
Okay.
Thank you. I also want to congratulate both of you. I think it's very inspiring, and somehow I try to listen to both of you. How can we connect this? And I have a question. Maybe I try. But I was wondering with regard to the book of Jekatyerina, if you look at the two examples from Hungary and Russia and how children perceive themselves. Did you also look at the curricula? Is there any reference to identity and, how relates Roma identity to national identity? On the other side, I think that's maybe where I think the connection is very interesting. But Anna wrote about mobilizing ethnic identity, and I wonder, Anna, whether there's anything, or if you think about schooling, what is the relation? Is there a relation you find there to mobilizing? Because obviously there are many examples, how identity can be a useful tool. So how can this go together? It's like ambiguous somehow how it's presented, but I wonder, where's the connection?
Yeah. So, we'll go back to that. I'll start. Please, each 1 minute. Yes, we have a minute.
So this is a great question, I think, and one that requires deep reflection. But I think what's really important is definitely a positive frame of identity, and presence of Roma in schools is both important for educational achievements of Roma children, but also for their capacity to actually mobilize the identity for collective action. I think that in my research, what was really particular, specifically in Spain, where there's a more research, also a larger size of the population, more policy and more presence in schools. I think that the very struggle or the very objective for quality of education or educational access can be in itself a collective interest that activates collective action, right? So this is something that's really important. And in Spain specifically, we see an increasing number of Roma people themselves requesting of the state respectful representation of identity and culture, and this has started to crystallize. So there's, review and school materials that have been written partially by Roma authors, which provide a more balanced image of what Roma identity, culture, and contributions to Spain is specifically. In the context of Latin American countries, so the 3 countries where I dedicated lots of time to research, so Colombia and Argentina and Mexico, which and finally did not make it to the final book version. But in all those 3 countries, the presence of Roma in school curricula is almost non-existent. And the process of activism or activating of the identity really happens in the context of opportunities and kind of tangible, positive promise that can happen through activism. But in schools, there wasn't any, or in school curricula more specifically, there wasn't really any representation of Roma. And that would be, important enough, maybe with the exception of Colombia, where Roma were mentioned as one of the many minority groups that are kind of composing the panorama of diversity in Colombia.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, shortly.
I know. I think all of them are very good questions, and I think more investigation needs to be done about why and how. And again, I don't have a generalizable sense of, it was one community in which the forms of oppression felt similar in terms of how they lived, the level of income, all the information I could gather, numerical information through the survey. But what was very different is that culture was seen as dynamic, as something that is changing. And culture was seen as a point of pride rather than, for example, shame. And the children too acted more collectively in school and acted with a sense of being proud of who they are, with a future plan of staying close to their community and passing on their culture to their children. That was very different. And in Hungary, it was the Bash community, the Munchan community in Varanya, where it was one major site, and another one was Vlach and Romulo. So actually, in Russia, it was only the Kalderash community, but in Hungary, it was a lot more diverse in terms of the schools where I was and the communities with which I could do interviews. And with the school, I didn't have to do this research because in the Indian context, there's a lot of research about the textbooks and the curriculum, and Roma usually appear in the context of the Holocaust and in the context of unemployment. So where they're mentioned, it's usually these 2 topics. But I didn't do that research.
Thank you so much. Thanks for this very, very interesting discussions. And I hope that you've been advisable.
It's free.
And also you will submit your,
it's
open access.
So there's no excuse not to.
Well, if you like to, support CU Press, so you can encourage your library to buy the book. Thank you so much, Emily, Anna, and Katya. And also, I would like to encourage you to submit your manuscript. We need that, guys. So you are the future scholars, and please think about your book. And hopefully, it's going to be a very, very rich, book series. Thank you so much for this really, really rich 2 days. And I would like to thank for our partners, ERIAC, the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture, that supported this conference. And we really would like to thanks for the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights, Harvard University. And we're also very grateful for the Critical Romani Studies Department at Södertörn University. And also for the CU Environmental and Social Justice Action Research Group. And I would like to thank for your participation, contribution, and last but not least, I'm really, really grateful for my colleagues at Romani Studies program. So thanks for Marty, Kaka, Alex work, we not able to organize such a conference. So thank you so much. And we would love to invite you for our modest reception. And And thanks. And we're going to continue this very rich discussion. Thank you.